Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. George Szamuely, a senior fellow at the Global Policy Institute, the co-host with Peter Lavelle of the podcast The Gaggle, and the author of the wonderful book Bombs for Peace: NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. The horrible consequences of that war, not only for Yugoslavia, Serbia, and all the other successor states, but also the entire transatlantic foreign policy, is what we want to discuss today. So, George, welcome.
Very, very good to be with you, Pascal.
Wonderful having you, because you wrote that book and you have been very vocal online about calling out the hypocrisies of the West, but also this warmongering DNA, which I think you point out in your book, very importantly, learned the pivotal lessons for the post-Cold War era in Yugoslavia. Could you maybe lay that out for us?
Well, it's very important to see what was done to Yugoslavia. The Western powers, initially Germany and then the United States and the United Kingdom, set about destroying an established state, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. They did that by violating every norm of international law, every norm of constitutional law. Um, what had happened in Yugoslavia is they had the first elections took place 1990, and almost immediately these various nationalist secessionist forces in Croatia and Slovenia in particular rushed to leave Yugoslavia. Now, in response to that, you would have thought the Western states, which adhere to international law, would say, well, okay, you need to go through some kind of a legal constitutional procedure. You can't just simply say, you have your first election and then you say, well, as first order of business, we're going to leave a common state that had existed for 70 years. You have to go through some constitutional procedure. That's what normally happens. But instead of that, Germany began pushing right away for the recognition of Croatia and Slovenia. And given that there was no formal constitutional process within Yugoslavia for secession, because Yugoslavia had, unlike the Soviet Union had been, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There were 15 republics, and in theory, all of the republics had the right of secession, though no procedure had ever been laid down for how they would exit the USSR until Gorbachev in 1990 adopted legislation what the procedure should be. But of course, that was completely ignored by the rather opportunistic republics, in particular Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So that procedure, what was legal and constitutional, was ignored. But Yugoslavia was a little different because Yugoslavia was the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which means that there was one state comprising 6 nations. So it wasn't in any sense like republics joining together to form a common state. There was a common state of 6 nations. Self-determination inhered in the nations, not in the republics. So all of that was ignored by the Western powers, and the Western powers just said about, well, okay, we are just going to go ahead and recognize these secessionists, and we're going to ignore the decisions of Yugoslavia's federal, legally established federal institutions, in particular the Federal Constitutional Court in Yugoslavia, which had ruled unanimously that secession is illegal, that the declarations of independence on the part of Croatia and Slovenia were illegal. We're going to ignore all of that. We're going to ignore the fact that there had been no Yugoslav-wide referendum on independence and whether they want to maintain the kind of the continuity of the state. We're just going to go ahead and recognize the secessions. And then they had to come up with some legal mumbo jumbo to justify what they did, which was the so-called Badinter Arbitration Commission, which was decided upon. There were 5 constitutional court judges five, all of whom came from Western Europe. Not one person came from Yugoslavia, the Balkans, somebody who actually knew the territory. Obviously, no one came from Russia. And they were the ones who just simply, made up absolutely ridiculous, one of the stupidest, worst set of rulings ever to justify what the Western powers did, which was to recognize the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the secession of the republics, and ignoring the wishes of all of the peoples of Yugoslavia, which was the majority, that wanted to continue with the common state. And so they ignored all of those wishes. And then they said, okay, well, now we've got our broken up Yugoslavia, and anyone who doesn't like it, we're going to apply sanctions against them and then eventually armed force.
Sorry, I just need to ask you about this because I'm not familiar with this tribunal. Can you give me the history of that tribunal? What it was and how it worked?
Well, you see, what had happened was that, as I say, Croatia and Slovenia, they rushed out of the exit and they said,
1991, right? We are in 1991, the latter part.
Exactly. So that was June the 25th, 1991. And then the European Community, was still called the EC at the time, stepped up and said, okay, what we'll do is we will hold something called an international conference on the former Yugoslavia to decide what to do. But then they, of course, cheated on how they went about doing this, because, of course, they ignored all of the federal Yugoslav institutions, like the Yugoslav presidency. They didn't care about what that said. They ignored the Yugoslav National Assembly. They ignored the Yugoslav Constitutional Court. We will only listen to the presidents of the republics. But of course, the presidents that they didn't want to pay any attention to was the president of Serbia, because Serbia was the most populous republic of Yugoslavia. And so they had to ignore the wishes of the Serbs and the Serbs' allies, the Montenegrins, and pay attention largely to the secessionists. Now, what this international conference for the former Yugoslavia did was they said, okay, well, this is all very vexing. What we'll do is we will set up an arbitration commission. But it didn't really work as in any sense an arbitration commission. And so because it wasn't like the one side presented its case, another side presented its case, and then an arbitrator tries to resolve the disputes.
Yeah. May I just interject? May I just interject? Because usually how arbitration works, if you do it in front of one of the arbitration courts, is that one side appoints one judge, the other side's another judge, and the two judges then appoint a third judge, and the ruling of that thing then holds as an arbitration if you have an arbitration agreement in the first place. So that was not what happened.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right in what you just pointed out. Because what happened was that they said, okay, we'll have this arbitration commission. We'll have 5 judges. 3 of the judges we will appoint ourselves, the European Community. We will appoint those 3 judges. And then they say, we'll turn around and say, go to the Yugoslavs and say, well, you appoint 2 of the judges. They couldn't agree among themselves. So then the 3 judges said, okay, well, we will appoint the remaining 2. And so what you got was 5 judges, all of whom came from, they were all basically presidents of the constitutional courts in Western Europe. You had Badinter himself, who's the head of the commission. He was the president of the French Constitutional Court. You had the head of the German Constitutional Court, the Spanish Constitutional Court, the Italian Constitutional Court. They were the ones who ultimately made the decision. But then they went even further, because Serbia, which basically led the group that wanted to keep Yugoslavia together, they formulated a set of questions to the arbitrators. But then that was rewritten, completely recast by the president of this international conference for the former Yugoslavia. Well, it wasn't called former, International Conference on Yugoslavia, which was Lord Carrington. And so Carrington recast these questions. So it's like you didn't even, the party didn't even get to present its issues. Carrington recast it in a way to get the desired answer. And why it's the desired answer? Because Germany had already made clear, this is December 1991. By then, Germany had already declared, I don't care what this decision you come to, we are going to recognize Croatia and Slovenia. I mean, they had already said this. So therefore, Badinter, this Badinter Commission, was already working on this deadline set by Germany, which is they had to come up with some legal findings that would justify what Germany intended to do, because there was no legal justification for recognizing secession. I mean, it's just simply against international law. But Germany said it was going to do it, so Badinter had to come up with a convoluted, nonsensical legal reasoning to justify this.
But I mean, shouldn't at least the Spanish constitutional judge have like opined against this? Because Spain is also in this precarious situation where you have like these different parts that would like to go, but you can't. But the constitution has a clause that says if all of Spain says like yes, you can go, then you're allowed to leave.
You would have thought that's exactly, but they decided, I guess, so that, well, Yugoslavia is kind of inferior peoples, the Balkans, and so what's good for Spain, because Spain doesn't recognize the right of anybody to secede from Spain, but what's may apply for Spain, or what may apply for France, doesn't apply to Yugoslavia. And so they came up with these findings. And the most important finding was that, well, Yugoslavia is no longer a state in existence, it's a state in dissolution. So because it's a state in dissolution, the republics that want to secede aren't really seceding. They are just simply acknowledging reality that it's a state in dissolution. But of course, he had no evidence for this. I mean, it wasn't a state in dissolution. I mean, it was the state institutions, all of which existed. He was just going around in circles by saying, well, since Croatia and Slovenia want to exit, therefore it must be a state in dissolution, and therefore, since it's a state in dissolution, it doesn't, it doesn't require any kind of support. And so that was the most important finding. And then they said, okay, well, the other finding was that these administrative boundaries were to become international frontiers. This is, of course, very, very ridiculous, because, in other words, there was to be no negotiation at all among the peoples of Yugoslavia, as that, hey, these were administrative boundaries that was fine as long as they existed a common state. But how can they be international frontiers? Because now you're going to find, one nation was here, and then it's another nation across the administrative border. Now they become citizens of another state, and so you kind of basically you're stripping people of their nationality, of their statehood. And so, but they said, oh well, these would just simply recognize these are international frontiers. We can't mess around with them. And that again showed its hypocrisy, because these boundaries were drawn up by the communists. They were drawn up in World War II by Tito's partisans. So they recognized that those are immutable, but they didn't recognize any of the institutions of Yugoslavia. As I say, Yugoslavia's constitutional court had made very definitive rulings saying secession is illegal. There's no procedure at all within the Yugoslav constitution for states just to simply pack up and leave. They ignored all of that, but they declare, oh, well, these boundaries drawn up by the communists in 1943, they are supposedly valid 50 years later.
It's quite fantastic. I mean, the hypocrisy on the one hand, and also just the self-righteousness with which all of this happened, and which then, of course, later on justifies intervention, right? And we haven't even gone that far, but it's very good that you point out how this happened. But can we go even one step further back? Because 1991 is the year after the Soviet Union finally. Wait, sorry, the Soviet Union.
Well, it's happening at the same time.
It's the same time.
Yeah.
But the crucial steps for the dissolution of the Soviet Union, for the secessionism of the Soviet Union, happened the year prior, right? In summer of 1990, and Bush's speech in Ukraine to the Rada, saying like, please don't secede because it's very dangerous, and then it happened anyhow. So the forces that did this, also this idea of like we need to preemptively recognize anything that the Croats and the Slovenes and so on say. Where did that come from? Was it influenced by this process in the Soviet Union?
I think that the Western powers saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to break up the Soviet Union and to break up Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, they took to be a kind of a stand-in for the Soviet Union, and there's it was like a mini Soviet Union um, located in Europe that could possibly be a problem for the kind of the Western goal of the NATOization of the entirety of the European continent, because Yugoslavia had built up a certain legitimacy as an independent communist state. The Tito had, come to power. I mean, obviously, he'd come to power with the help of the Red Army in World War II, but nonetheless, they had a falling out. The Soviet Union and Yugoslavia had a falling out. And since that falling out, the relations had improved. Yugoslavia did chart an independent course and had, been developed its own form of communism.
And
It's certain market forces and, decentralization, worker control, and so that's why Yugoslavia was seen as a potential problem for the goal of sort of the NATOization of Europe. Therefore, hey, this might be a kind of a model of socialism that could be attractive to the Eastern European states that we want to scoop up as quickly as possible into the EU and NATO.
And it was also a champion of the non-aligned movement. It was a champion of the precursor to today's like Global South, BRICS, and so on movement.
It's one of the.
Tito was
Right.
the European. And in this sense, Yugoslavia was very successfully neutral in this entire Cold War affair. Do you, in your research, did you find any indications that say like, yeah, this kind of not with us, and therefore against us, like mentality was playing out in the way that the West Europeans and also the Americans approached the Yugoslavia?
Yes, absolutely. Because what they saw in Yugoslavia was the problem of Serbia. They saw Serbia as a real problem for us because they thought Serbia has this very close relationship with Russia. They, obviously historically, linguistically, culturally, the church and everything that's they connected with Russia, and the president of Serbia was Slobodan Milosevic. Slobodan Milosevic was seen as, an inheritor of the communist system. He came up within the communist system, as did the other leaders in Yugoslavia. But unlike them, he really wasn't willing to discard everything of communism. And so he almost immediately became this demonized figure. He emerges in 1987, and then you can see really how the Western media were apoplectic. They liked all these kind of new kinds of leaders that were emerging in the rest of Eastern Europe, who basically just wanted to throw in their lot with the West. But Milosevic was kind of saying, well, we will continue to chart our own independent, non-aligned course, just as you said. In other words, yeah, we will continue with that, in the future Yugoslavia. And then he really became this demonized figure in the Western media. And then the secessionists in the other republics were very clever. They said, hey, look, the West really has come to hate Milosevic. They don't like the Serbs. We don't like the Serbs. So we'll make our pitch to the Western powers and say, we are oppressed. We are under the thumb of the Serbs, and they're all communists, and we are trying to liberate ourselves from the communists. And that was a successful pitch. And then, they didn't, the Western powers were not particularly interested in looking into the background, particularly of the Croatian leader, Tudjman, who had openly espoused fascist ideas and, openly invited fascists to come to Croatia. What they heard was, this talk about how the Serbs are communists, they're pro-Soviet, and they want to, subjugate us to this communist yoke. Because if you look through the media reporting, the late 80s through 1991, it's all about how the Serbs, the communists, they want to reimpose totalitarianism on the rest of the people of Yugoslavia.
It's I'm sorry to ask you this because we have to jump so much because there are so many details that need to be unpacked here. But this approach of then also using individual leaders and completely ignoring where they're coming from. Franjo Tuđman was by all means a communist. He was a communist apparatchik, right? And ignoring all of that, ignoring the I mean, we've seen that time and again, and we see it with Ukraine, right? We see with Ukraine a sudden ignoring of something that was acknowledged all the way before, which is that there is right-wing fascist nationalism in Ukraine, and then suddenly that became like glorious heroes. I had though one more guest on my show, David Gibbs, who also pointed out that the entire Yugoslav affair, while it was developing, and it was developing inside a very um, very very turbulent time, the 1991, 92, and so it did have a precursor. And he said Afghanistan, the way the United States fomented and made and war in Afghanistan, all but inevitable, was something that later came to be implemented also in Yugoslavia in the way that you work with these different rebel factions and thereby then weaken the adversary. From your research, would you support that analysis?
I think so. I mean, there's a certain timeline that you have to go through. So we start with Croatia. This is 1991. Now, Tuđman, yes, he had been a communist, but he'd had a falling out with the communists. He had been imprisoned by Tito in 1970 as part of the whole Croatian Spring, which was the revival of Croatian nationalism. Now, that's a serious business when you start reviving Croatian nationalism, particularly everybody, the Serbs in particular, remember the horrors of the fascist state during World War II. Tuđman was very much associated with that. And for instance, the kind of veteran journalist, British journalist Nora Beloff, real expert on the Balkans, she wrote, I think around about 1991, when no one was really paying attention to this, it says, look, I met Tuđman in 1980. And the thing that struck me right away when I met him, this is 1980, still communist era, he hated the Serbs. He had a pathological, obsessive hatred of the Serbs. So everything that we're seeing now in 1990, 1991 in Croatia is a direct result of Tuđman and the people around Tuđman and their absolute loathing of the Serbs and their determination to basically get rid of the Serbs of Croatia and anything that was distinctively Serb about Croatia. So remember, I mean, the way it worked in Yugoslavia was Croatia, according to its constitution, they had several constitutions. In each of its constitutions said Croatia is the state of the Croats and the Serbs. It wasn't just that, oh, it's the state of the Croats and they're the Serb minorities or whatever. It is a joint state of the Croats and the Serbs. Tuđman, first thing he does, he changes the constitution and says it's just the state of the Croats. The Serbs have become a minority. And so by being a minority, then essentially he can start making these decisions, constitutional decisions, such as, holding a referendum on independence, which the Serbs had opposed, by saying, well, we've now changed the constitution. We don't need to pay any attention to what the Serb minority has to say. So that's 1991. 1992, we get the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where you have this kind of Islamist figure. Also, he had been in prison. This is Alija Izetbegović. He had been in prison. He was in prison after World War II for collaborating with the Nazis. But then he was in prison during Yugoslav time over, also for his Islamism. And then you have the sort of the Western propaganda system that goes and tells us, well, Izetbegović, he's very secular. He's a secular Muslim. He wasn't anything of the sort. I mean, you just look through his writings. He wrote prodigiously about Islamism and how Islam is incompatible with the West and so on. He was an Islamist. So the Western media, just as with Tuđman, it minimized, all of Tuđman's sort of fascist sympathies, his Serbophobia. So they presented Izetbegović as some kind of a secular Muslim. But I think what just in terms of the division of labor, Croatia and Slovenia were kind of German projects. Bosnia and Herzegovina was an American project. And so the Americans decided, well, we want to promote Izetbegović as a kind of moderate secular Muslim. the kind of Muslim we like. These are the sort of like the Muslims in Turkey. That was, it was still before. This is before the Erdogan era. So we get that kind of secular, pro-Western, pro-NATO. Unlike the Muslims who don't like the ones in Iran or in Iraq and so on. This is the type that we like. So the Americans embraced the cause of Izetbegovic, and so they were very eager to push for independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but which was very problematic because the Muslims really comprise only 43% of the population. The Serbs were about 33%, and then the rest were Croats. So they had to ignore the demography of Bosnia and Herzegovina and still push for independence, knowing, and they knew this perfectly well, that the Serbs would simply not accept it because they said, we have national self-determination. We want to remain a part of Yugoslavia. Why should we be pushed out of Yugoslavia on account of Izetbegovic? And we certainly don't want to be ruled by, somebody who's, an Islamist. And so the Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina said, well, we want out. We want to remain a part of Yugoslavia. They were, of course, absolutely ferociously denounced by the Western powers and were quickly put under sanction. And eventually they were bombed in 1994 and 1995.
Did anyone ever ask the Croats in Bosnia-Herzegovina? Because I do remember visiting a Croat friend in Herzegovina, and he showed me up in the hill the little cave where for 150 years they were practicing hidden Catholicism because it was forbidden under the Ottoman Empire and the occupation. So did anyone ask the Croats? Because at the end of the day, it would have been better to stick with Yugoslavia if push came to shove.
It would have been, absolutely would have been. But the problem was that Croatia had made its exit. Once Croatia had made its exit out of Yugoslavia, the Croats of Bosnia and Herzegovina said, okay, we want to join them. We want to be a part of this, of the Croatian state. So they did support this, the independence because they held a referendum stipulated by Badinter, so that there be a referendum in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that Badinter made very sure that there wouldn't be a nationwide Yugoslav-wide referendum, but there'd be referendums in the individual republics. Now, that referendum in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that was boycotted by the Serbs because they said this violates the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is you can't have any constitutional change that is opposed by one of the three constituent nations. There are three constituent nations of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Serbs are opposed to it. It's one constituent nation. You can't have a constitution. It's a violation. You can't have a referendum. That's a violation of the constitution. Nonetheless, they went ahead with the referendum. Badinter cared nothing about the constitution. Now, the Croats did support this because they saw this as independence of Bosnia was step one. Step two, they would secede from the independent state of Bosnia and join with Croatia. But even in Badinter's own terms, there wasn't a sufficient vote, even with the Serbs taking no part, boycotting this referendum. Even with that, they didn't get the 2/3 vote that was necessary for the secession of Bosnia and Herzegovina to be recognized. But nonetheless, they said, okay, that's it. That's good enough for us. We recognize it. But then, well, this is another one of Badinter's findings. They refused to accept the core Yugoslavia as the remaining state of Yugoslavia. In other words, like when the Soviet Union dissolves, Russia is the successor state to the Soviet Union. They said, no, we're not going to recognize this core Yugoslavia that wants to remain Yugoslavia, which was at that time Serbia and Montenegro. It's a brand new state. You're going to have to reapply for membership to the United Nations. And of course, when the Serbia and Montenegro, what remained of Yugoslavia, we're not going to reapply because we are the continuation of Yugoslavia, and they were promptly kicked out of the United Nations. So they made sure throughout all of those Badinter's findings that they rewarded the secessionists,
Yeah.
and all of the people, and you would have to say at least 50% of Yugoslavia wanted the state to continue. Those people, those 50% plus who wanted the Yugoslavia to continue, were absolutely resolutely ignored. They got nothing from Badinter.
And of course it continued, and it continues until today, this arbitrariness. Because if you look at Kosovo today, the main grievance at the moment of the Serb minority in Kosovo is that they want out. They want to join Serbia, but they're not given the minority right to actually do that, because within Kosovo they're now told that no, you have to comply with your own constitution. Secessionism is illegal in Kosovo. Although when it comes to Kosovo, we don't recognize that Serbia says secessionism is illegal, and they just do that, and within the same breath they do it. And so this is a 30-year history of just arbitrarily setting who we give power and who we don't, and therefore swallow it and be quiet. And by the way, now Kosovo, you're going to have the largest NATO base in the Balkans, and it will continue. Thank you very much.
Exactly, and that's really very interesting, because you have the Badinter's findings. They said, okay, the successor states to Yugoslavia are the republics. So that, the six republics here: Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and Macedonia. So those would be the successors, and no changes in those administrative borders. They're now international frontiers. But then they turned around and changed their position on Serbia. Said, well, yeah, actually, Kosovo, which at that time was sort of accepted as part of Serbia. Oh, Kosovo can apparently secede from Serbia. So they suddenly said, oh, Kosovo can do it. Kosovo secede. Now,
but not the Serbs in Kosovo, not the Serbs, because good secessionists, bad secessionists.
That's right. So Kosovo, they can just take, that province of Kosovo, they can secede. But what about the Serbs, the Serb minority in Kosovo? No, they don't have self-determination, but Kosovo is over there. But what is the basis of that? Because what they call Kosovo is just a province inhabited by Albanians. Now, Albanians already have their own state. So what exactly is the legal basis for another Albanian state? I mean, there's no such nation as the Kosovars. I mean, the media may repeat about Kosovars. There's no such people. So there already exists an Albanian state, which is why under the constitution of Yugoslavia, the Albanians of Yugoslavia were deemed a national minority, not a constituent nation, because their national aspirations had already been fulfilled in the state of Albania. So they say, okay, well, Kosovo exists as a state, so we're going to give this to the Albanians. But what about the Serbs, who, after all, are were a constituent nation of Yugoslavia? They have their state, Serbia. Why are they unable to join the state of Serbia? No, we can't do it. You have to stay in this Albanian dominated, but now deemed a state.
Do you have an answer for that? I mean, an answer based upon the geostrategic thinking of the West. I mean, wouldn't it be easier to get rid of the Serbia problem by just letting them rejoin Serbia and therefore have a 100% lovely and Western abiding Kosovo left?
Well, I think they went out of their way to humiliate the Serbs as much as possible. And I think they would also think that if they were to do that, then that would give ideas, which is still, and that's a problem for them at the moment, that the Serbs in the Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they would want out, and they obviously do want out. They would want to join Serbia. So they came up with all these, convoluted ways of trying to keep the Serbs down, trying to humiliate them as much as possible. So the Serbs have to stay in Kosovo, in essentially their enclaves in this Albanian-dominated province, and the Serbs have, in Republika Srpska, they have to remain within this the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which isn't really even any kind of a state. So they just went through all of these procedures just in order to make sure that the Serbs are as humiliated as possible. But there's also another aspect of it, which is obviously kind of divide and rule. I mean, as long as everybody hates everybody else and everybody's permanently in conflict with everyone else, then the Balkans become quite easy to manage. I mean, the Germans obviously blazed the trail in that during World War II, but then essentially the European Union, under the influence of Germany, obviously has done exactly the same thing to the former Yugoslavia.
It's so ugly. It's so ugly because it also costs so many lives. It's also so ugly on an international legal basis because it messes up with all of these principles. And of course, what one of the things that these people never keep in mind is that the precedents they set, others will learn. So it is extremely ironic that it is Russia now that says, like, look, we're just repeating your
Right.
approach in Ukraine. Can you draw a couple of the parallels that actually other states have learned from this way of implementing their will on others?
Well, that was it, because in the case of Russia, they in fact said at the time that the West rushed to recognize Kosovo in 2008. Well, we're going to learn from this, and they went ahead. In the case of Crimea in 2014, they said, "Well, we'll have a referendum." I mean, they actually didn't have a referendum in Kosovo; they just recognized a declaration by the Kosovo parliament. But they had a referendum in Crimea, and of course the West howled, "Oh, this is illegal! This is illegal! This is a part of Ukraine." Now, what is the basis of their claim that it's a part of Ukraine? Well, in 1991, at the time of the basically illegal, unconstitutional dissolution of the USSR, there was never any legal basis for what happened. Under that, in Belovesh, December 1991, those were the borders of Ukraine. So that those now become the international frontiers under which we're obligated to recognize in perpetuity. And then the Russians turned around and said, "Well, why should we? I mean, when it came to Serbia, you said you weren't going to recognize the borders of Serbia, having first said in 1991, 92 that these are the international frontiers of Serbia, and then you turn around and say, no, well, they're not the international frontiers. We're just going to declare this province as an independent state. So we're going to do the same thing. Why should we be obligated to recognize the state of affairs in December 1991 as existing in perpetuity?" So the Russians did that in the case of Crimea, and then of course they did that in the case of the Donbass, initially the Donetsk and Lugansk, and then of course they added, which is Kherson and Zaporozhye. So they said, okay, this is now a part of the Russian Federation. Now the West screams, "Oh, international law! You can't change international frontiers." But you did that in the case of Yugoslavia. You just went ahead and dissolved an existing state. You did it in violation not just of the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, not just in all of the United Nations declarations, when you basically are not supposed to recognize any kind of secessions. That's deemed to be part of the unfriendly acts towards other states. The 1970 Declaration about unfriendly acts towards other states. You went ahead and did that, broke it up. You didn't regard that as in any way that you were messing around with international frontiers. And now suddenly, oh, the international frontiers of Ukraine, we can't do anything about it. It's nothing but total hypocrisy and opportunism. There are no principles of this. I mean, as I say, you go and read those declarations of Badinter, sort of the most ridiculous legal findings by the top constitutional court lawyers in Western Europe, this nonsense that they came up with, and then thought, oh, we'll accept that, and then you say how suddenly the Western powers are very solemnly proclaiming, well, we have to adhere to international laws. We can't just simply start changing international frontiers. Well, that's what you did. You did that in Yugoslavia over and over again.
Can you explain to me maybe also like what you know about the German rationale? Because the Germans just emerged in 1990, 1991 as the greatest winners of the end of the Cold War, because basically we call it reunification, but that's not what it was. It was like West Germany swallowing up East Germany. The East German state died. It died and it was gone, and its institutions were killed. Its elites were basically told to leave and not come back, and everything was replaced. Right? It was like West Germany swallowing East Germany, and at the same time, we then have the breakup of both like the Soviet Union and of Yugoslavia, and the broken up Yugoslavia really broken up with an axe. And the Czechoslovakia. I mean, we call it velvet divorce. I have no fixed opinion on that one, but on Yugoslavia, like, what is it that made the West Germans go so toxic on Yugoslavia?
No, it's a very interesting question because um, you go to October the 3rd, 1990, which is the day of the German reunification. Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor, he sends a telegram to every single head of state in the world and declares henceforth only peace will emanate from German soil. And this was word for word what was in that 2+4 agreement that was rushed through on the 12th of September, so really just a couple of weeks before the reunification. So it says, okay, peace will emanate from Germany. Within a few months, the same Helmut Kohl, the same Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, went ahead and essentially they just pushed for this. They just pushed, with extraordinary aggression that they would recognize Croatia and Slovenia, and they didn't care who would object to what they were doing. So what was really behind this? Well, I think Germany was asserting itself in Europe, contrary to all of the proclamations that they had made. And to be honest, I have to say, this has been a pattern of Germany since the reunification. I think they played nice. West Germany had kind of played nice for all these years. Oh, we're different, we're changed. We're not interested in any kind of aggression. We want to work with our neighbors, with all our partners. We're just not going to do any of the things that we used to do. Look at Germany now. I mean, Germany now openly says we are in conflict, with Russia. That was Chancellor Merz the other day. Annalena Baerbock said we are at war with Russia. It would be almost unthinkable for any German government to be saying that. So Germany has emerged, that kind of is reasserting itself. So he did it initially.
Yeah.
Croatia and Slovenia were their allies. They're allies in World War II. So that was they were essentially restoring their historical interest in the Balkans, as well as their hatred, their absolute loathing for the Serbs. It's a deep pathological hatred for the Serbs, going back through to the 19th century. And then Helmut Kohl, and you could see some of that now with the restoration of this hatred for Russia, and that pervades throughout the German media. You talk to Germans and say, it is day and night within German media, absolute loathing for the Russians. One was recalling, the old days of the 1930s, just the vehemence of against Russia, and the refusal to entertain even the slightest any perspective different from that, to try to listen to Russia's case or anything like that. You don't get any of that in German public discourse at all.
Yeah, and let's not forget all of these other hypocrisies, and they need to be called out because they are kind of a national schizophrenia, right? Also, the good Muslims versus bad Muslims game of Germany, when it said never again, it meant never again against people who we like.
That's right.
Never.
Exactly.
I mean, no genocide without Germany. I mean, that's one of the baselines of Europe, right? So currently, the genocide on the Muslim population, on the Gaza population, the Palestinian population, because they're not just Muslims, they're also Christians and Druze and others. That's one of them. And then, of course, like at the same time, while justifying the genocide down there, you cry wolf about what China is doing to its Muslim minority in Xinjiang. It's like it just blows you up, but it shows you that it's all actually all of these speech acts, all of these moral speech acts are purely geostrategic, not geostrategic. They are purely like national interest based on who you want to hate and who not.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, obviously you have the Palestinians that don't care at all. We have a special relationship with Israel because of our history. So that means you sign on to every kind of horrific slaughter, atrocity. You don't care about because you have a special relationship with Israel, so they don't care about that. But they do care about the Chechens. When the Chechens, during the years of the Chechen wars in Russia, the Germans were in the forefront. Absolutely outraged by what was being done to the Chechens. So those were the good Muslims, they're because they're against the Russian. And then again, you see, this reinforces the pattern because it's kind of what Nazi Germany did. That they also made all of these distinctions. Which are the Muslims that we're going to support? Well, we're going to support obviously the Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They're against because they're against the Serbs, so they're good. We will support the Muslims within the Soviet Union. They're going to be on our side. Quite like the Muslims in Turkey. So essentially, you just make these arbitrary decisions entirely according to whatever geopolitical game that you're playing. You're right, they were geostrategic because you don't even see how exactly Germany does well out of this. But what Germany is doing now, which is quite smart, and they've learned their lesson from history, is don't get isolated. Always stick with the pack. That's the big mistake I thought we did in World War I, World War II. We were isolated. So this time, you stick with the pack. Above all, make sure that you've got the Jews on your side. Don't go against that. That's always a bad idea. Make sure you're with the United States and the UK. So as long as you're part of the majority, then you can pretty much do whatever you want. And so that's why Germany is perfectly happy to continue with the slaughter, funding the slaughter in Palestine, arming Israel, and basically it just gets away with it by saying, "Oh, we have this special relationship. We have to support Israel because of something or other." Totally made up argument because that wasn't the view of Germany in the 1970s. Helmut Schmidt didn't think that we have to support Israel because of what happened in the 1930s and 40s. This is just something today that Germany has just made up. The 1930s and 40s should guide our policy towards Israel.
Yeah, a lot of these concepts are made up and conjured out of thin air, and then you claim that it always was like that. And you,
That's right.
especially the speech act, the repeated speech acts, the ones that drill it into the mind of the people. Like, let's say another example, the rules-based international order. They make it sound as if though that terminology had been around ever since 45. When in fact it was made up less than 10 years ago, because before that
Exactly.
nobody called it like that. This is just another way of like justifying arbitrary approaches to international law.
That's right. It is actually quite extraordinary that they do this. They make up this the rules based order, and to the unsuspecting observer, he said, "Well, that sounds good. That somehow, well, yeah, that's how we in the West like to think of ourselves. Yeah, we believe in rules, we believe in order, we believe in a civilized way of resolving disputes." Except when you start looking at historical examples, that's exactly the opposite of what you did in Yugoslavia. You consistently disobeyed all the rules. You broke all the rules, and you just went ahead, rushed through a totally destructive policy guaranteed to end in war. But somehow this is how the West wants to think of itself. Another interesting example, I guess, when we talk about Germany is like we have the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, totally nonsensical entity that was created in 1993 by the UN Security Council. Russia, unfortunately, was kind of absent without leave at the time and supported this. And then, of course, they've basically been sending Serbs, pretty much all the entirety of the Serb leadership, to prison, life sentences. I mean, life sentences are the norm, when the Serb leaders are all serving life sentences. They serve 25 years, ask for clemency. Nope, no clemency. Um, and of course, this is a much harsher treatment than anything that was meted out to the Germans after World War II. Now, leave aside the first Nuremberg trial and the major Nazi leaders who were executed, but not all of them. Some were acquitted. No one gets acquitted at the ICDY. But some were acquitted. And then you have somebody like Albert Speer, who as armaments minister was definitely involved in war crimes. He got 20 years and then lived on another 20 years in retirement, had a very comfortable life, writing books, giving interviews, and so on. And then not to mention, lower level Nazis, SS, and so on, who didn't do anything. I mean, there were nothing would ever happen to them in post-war West Germany. But now the Germans, they go around arresting Serbs. They can go arrest a Serb, shove the Serb into prison for 40 years. 40 years, for, crimes that, pale in comparison to anything that the Nazis did. So again, the Germans present, whoa, we have to, because of our special past, we feel very strongly about war crimes. We feel we have to really, continue with this judicial process.
And then the others. The war crimes of those who are not on your side, those are the bad ones. You see it at the moment, how they care about one war crime when it comes from Russia, not about the other one. We see how they care about every single soul who died on 7th of October and not about a single one that's dying in the fire rates. So.
That's right. That's it. That's exactly how you play the game.
Yeah.
Exactly that. But 7th of October. That's it. And every time they make speeches, it's always 7th of October, 7th of October, 7th of October. But what happened since then? I mean, however many died,
or before,
yeah, exactly, or before. That's always the case. That you never bring up anything that happens before. So it's like whenever people, to the extent that people talk about Yugoslavia today, they just pick on one event, Srebrenica. Oh, Srebrenica. As okay, that's in July 1995. So what about what happened before? When there was the 4 years that preceded Srebrenica. Well, no one wants to talk about that. Let's just pick one event, take it completely out of context, and then, of course, give a very distorted idea of what actually happened. But it's a way that you construct these stories, and then that tells you who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. So that's right. Nothing happens before 7th of October. Nothing happens after. So we can just simply talk about the 7th of October.
And we must just point out, George, I think that it is pure coincidence, historical coincidence, that we ourselves are always on the good side of history. It's pure coincidence. If we ever were not on the good side of history, we learn about that 200 years later, and then we kind of atone by putting email footers, recognizing the indigenous lands of these people and so on. 200 years later. May I just switch one more moment and go to this, how the West works, or how the mentality of this works, by just quoting you from your book, because you have a beautiful passage in the conclusion where you quote Tony Blair, where he said in 1999, NATO's success in Kosovo will be the biggest deterrent to tyrants the world over and the biggest rallying call for democracy. That is why, whatever it takes, we must succeed, and the policy of brutal savagery that is ethnic cleansing must fail and be seen to fail. Says Blair in 1999. It's so reminiscent to what we are hearing about Ukraine, isn't it? Like the ring to it, the tone. Can you speak to
That's
it?
right. No, that's right. And of course, what they did in 1999 was obviously completely illegal. It had the exact opposite effect of what they wanted. It was supposed to be humanitarian, but of course it was absolutely destructive and devastating. Supposedly they were trying to prevent war crimes. Then according to the ICTY, that only increased war crimes. And then, of course, the flood of refugees, which supposedly provoked the bombing, the flood of refugees, of course, increased exponentially as a result of the bombing. But because Serbia was relatively easy to defeat, NATO and Tony Blair, they went in for a lot of self-congratulation. Well, fantastic, we did this. We won. We defeated. Not only did you win, you were like a boxer. You won the fight, but you get to feel that you're the good guy. And then that, of course, led, that, of course, was the hubris that led to the onslaught against Afghanistan, but of course Iraq really just a little more than 2 years later, because they thought, well, we're obviously the good guys. It's going to be pretty easy to defeat a much weakened Iraq. The Iraq had already been, after more than 10 years of sanctions, and then we'll get to have another opportunity to congratulate ourselves. We defeated the tyrant Saddam Hussein, and everything else. But then, just as you say, what happens when this war goes wrong is you have, within a few years, a quick revision. Yeah, that was a mistake. It was probably we shouldn't have done that. And so you think, what's the consensus now? Yeah, we probably should have given that one a miss. But nobody was saying it at the time. They said it because, hey, we've got to go in. We've got to go into Iraq. The people who were against the Iraq war were in a very small minority.
Although these people are still proud of what they did, even if they say Iraq was a mess, they still say it's good that Saddam Hussein is gone, and we did, overall the good outcome was achieved, even though the instruments were messy. And if I ask these people who say like, you cannot attack a sovereign nation, and I tell them, well, you attacked Iraq, didn't you? And it's like, oh, that's not the same. You cannot compare it. One is a dictatorship, the other one is a blooming democracy. They don't. I mean, and I tell them, look, but international law doesn't care about the political system. Then they usually reply, incomparable. He was about to kill millions in his own country, or 5 million.
That's right. Well, that's exactly right. And those were the justifications that were being made at the time, during the arguments about the invasion of Iraq. And you say, hey, look, I was arguing, well, look, this is a sovereign nation. I mean, you look at the UN Charter. There's nothing in the UN Charter that says that non-democracies are, it's open season on them. You can attack a country that if you don't like its form of government. There's nothing in the UN Charter. It says all states, irrespective of their domestic arrangements. But then these people who make these fanciful extrapolations of international law, just as I was saying about the Bad Inter and then the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, they make this saying, yeah, but the way international law has evolved is that certain states don't really have legitimacy. So because they're not democratic, because they don't really protect their own people, they don't have immunity from attack by others. And that was the kind of the germ of this whole idea of the responsibility to protect, that, you can actually arbitrarily decide that certain states don't protect their populations. And so others can come in and bomb and overthrow or do whatever they want to do. So they said that was an argument made about Iraq. And you're right, there are people who still justify Iraq. Well, at least we got rid of Saddam Hussein. But because so many Americans died and it was clearly became very unpopular in the United States, that it's still a kind of an embarrassment. And it was based on lies. I mean, you can't get around the lies that were spread about the weapons of mass destruction. So it's kind of become an embarrassment. So people just don't really want to talk about it very much. So that's same with Vietnam. Vietnam was extremely popular in the early days. Then when it became gradually unpopular and the war didn't seem to be coming to any kind of conclusion, then America ended it. And then it seems everybody was against it from the beginning. It's like you're hard put to find anyone at all who was for it. Oh yeah, of course I was against Vietnam. So that's always the way these things work. If it succeeds, or at least succeeds in those terms, as they think Yugoslavia succeeded, because they kind of gave in, not on everything, but at least they gave in after the 11 weeks of bombing. Then they congratulate themselves and go on talking about what a fantastic intervention this was. If it doesn't, then they kind of say, yeah, it just didn't really work. Wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time. Better luck next time. So that I think that's been the view of case of Iraq, and of course before that Vietnam, and to a certain extent Libya as well.
Yeah, and when it didn't end well, and especially if you have to exit, then you put bone-crushing sanctions as well, just to strangulate whatever is left of the mess that you created. And Afghanistan is currently there, right? But anyhow,
And it was true of Vietnam as well. The United States,
and Cuba.
as part of the Paris Peace Accord, the United States was promised enormous amount of aid to Vietnam to help rebuild the country. Not one penny. The United States didn't come up with a single penny to Vietnam after the Paris Peace Accord. So they always. There was the sanctions didn't apply, but you're absolutely the sanctions remain in place until there's a regime change that the West desires.
And for some reason, the West can understand how it is that these savage nations like Vietnam and India and so on do not side with them when it comes to approaching Russia and China. It's like it's unfathomable. Why? Why would that be? But anyhow, like as a very last question to wrap this up, would you say that Yugoslavia was the conclusion of the victory of the West in the Cold War, or was it the beginning, the new blueprint of how to implement hegemony for as long as you can?
I think it was. That's a really good question. I think it was the beginning of the kind of post
The
Cold
unipolar
War.
moment.
Yeah, and I think it's in a very interesting way that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was the opportunity for the West to essentially express its dominance, particularly of the European continent, but then obviously going on into Eurasia. Because for the West, I think the outcome of World War II really wasn't very satisfactory, because basically it was the Soviet Union that broke the back of the Wehrmacht, and the West had to accept this. The West had to accept that this outcome of this war, in which Eastern Europe remained within the Soviet sphere of influence, and the Soviet Union was this formidable military power. And the West really was very unhappy about this. And so, in a way, it was once that power kind of disintegrated from 1991, then the West, so now we can get the outcome we really wanted all along. And so this push against Yugoslavia was really part of the push against Russia, and that goes back a long way. I mean, it goes back to the 1930s. It goes even before that, an attempt to push Russia out of Europe altogether. And Yugoslavia was seen as the stand-in for Russia. Russia had always been involved in the Balkans. The British had had problems with Russian involvement in the Balkans. The Serbs were seen as the kind of Russia's allies. They had then worries about, well, maybe there's some other who will also look upon Russia as allies. Maybe the Bulgarians will look upon Russia as an allies. So the reason for that onslaught against Yugoslavia was to push Russia out of Europe once and for all. Not unlike, as I say, the pre 1939 European projects. And in a way, it continues to this day, because the outcomes of the wars in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Kosovo were not wholly satisfactory for the West. They had to put up with a divided Bosnia and Herzegovina. The West's goal was a unitary state of Bosnia that would be a member of NATO and would take its orders from Brussels. They had to put up with this loose confederation comprising a Serb state of Bosnia. And that's what they're doing now that they've removed this leader, Milorad Dodik, from power in the Republika Srpska. This is the West's opportunity to undo what they had to put up, what they had to accept in 1995 at Dayton, which is the creation of the Serb entity. They could well now move and try to dissolve the Serb entity altogether in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Same with Serbia and Kosovo. They still have not been able to force Serbia to give up on Kosovo. So that's why the West continues with this agenda, because as long as the Serbs are there, somehow Russia maintains its presence of some kind of influence in Europe. And that's why there's endless media stories about how Russians are making trouble in the Balkans. There's, the Russian agents. There's all these problems with Vucic is clearly working with the Russians, and Dodik is with the Russians. It's a perpetual obsession that somehow we haven't got the whole thing, the whole pie, which should be in the West, but instead we still have to share it somehow with Russia. So that, I think, it was the first of the kinds of wars in which the West wants to express its total geopolitical dominance. Ultimately, and that goes back, I guess, to the Halford-Mackinder thesis of the dominance of the Eurasian landmass.
Yeah, and it's just a repetition of the stupidity of not accepting a yes for an answer, because the Serbs want to join the EU. The Serbs just also say we're not going to join NATO. They are saying we are military neutral. We are actually going to play with everybody, but that's not something those people can accept. It needs to be all for us and all against the other, or nothing, or you are yourself part of the problem.
And exactly, they tell the Serbs, you want to join the EU, and that's not going to happen. But that's the condition. They said you have to do two things. You have to accept the loss of Kosovo, completely wash your hands of Kosovo once and for all, accept that it's an independent state, and you have to cut yourself off from Russia. Impose sanctions on Russia. Cut off all trade with Russia. Those are the conditions if you want to join our club. And the Serbs just, they're not willing to do that. And, they'd like to be a part of the EU, but they're not willing to sacrifice everything. But that's what the Europeans and the Americans are demanding of them.
Yeah, and of course, naturally, this causes exactly the opposite effect, just like in Georgia. Georgia learned its lessons. The Serbs, they know that they cannot throw their lot into one or the other basket completely. You have to play with everybody. Sorry, and I know I said it's the last question, but very last follow-up, because you interestingly now said that what the West wanted to achieve in the 90s was to completely push out Russia. This flies a little bit in the face of the interpretation that the West got drunk on having won the Cold War and having now having like destroyed the Soviet Union and therefore not paying attention to Russia. Because what you're implying is that they were still paying enough attention in order to try to completely wrestle anything out of the orbit of the successor state. How do you see that?
Well, no, what I mean is that there was a concern that sooner or later Russia will recover, and that they had to make sure that even if that happens, if Russia recovers, and they were going to make sure Russia doesn't recover, they did as much as they could to create as many problems inside Russia as possible, but that they wanted to make sure that that if Russia recovers, there'll be nothing for it to come back to, that all of the states of Eastern Europe will have been scooped up into NATO and the EU. And in particular, the real problem for Europe and the United States was the Balkans, because that was the one area where there was a real sentimental attachment to Russia, going back to the 19th century, going back also to World War I, where Russia entered the war, kind of and destroyed itself on behalf of Serbia. So that was when there was the fear. So on the one hand, I think initially the concern was that Yugoslavia, if it survived, would form an attractive alternative, a kind of a market-based socialism, and as attractive alternative to Eastern Europe that was very quickly being scooped up into the neoliberal order. So they wanted to make sure that was destroyed. But after you destroyed that, and that became clear that Yugoslavia wouldn't survive, then they had to deal with Serbia, because as long as Serbia was there, as long as the Serbs were there, the dominant people in the Balkans, then Russia would have some influence in Europe. And I think that's why they had to push NATO expansion, and then continue to apply more and more pressure against the Serbs. So make sure that we never again have to have Russia in our continent.
That makes very good sense. And everybody listening, don't mistake anything that George said for a grand master plan of the puppeteers. It is more the forces of these neoliberal and neocon groupings that then lead down the path of history. George Szamuely, people want to follow you. They should go to your podcast first and
Yeah,
foremost.
absolutely. The podcast, you'll find it on thegaggle.locals.com. You can also find it on YouTube. You can also follow me on Substack. You can follow me on Twitter. And above all, please try and buy my book. It's a little pricey, unfortunately. It's not my decision. Bumps of Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War in Yugoslavia.
Everybody, the links will be down in the description below. George Szamuely, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Pascal.